All right, Danielle. Good to see you.
Nice to see you, David.
We're talking about TikTok. I think a lot of people are talking about TikTok when they got their little notice this weekend that said no more TikTok. It only lasted for I don't know, not even 12 hours, I feel like.
Well, I'm taking your word on that because you have TikTok and I don't, but I know you sent me the screenshots.
You're not an avid TikToker? I find that hard to believe.
You
No?
don't know me at all.
No.
You should read what the notifications you got on Saturday and how it compared to the notification you got yesterday on Sunday.
Yeah.
And we get to set the stage, right? So Friday the 17th, the Supreme Court, January 17th, the Supreme Court opinion of TikTok et al., meaning lots of other people, against Merrick Garland as the Attorney General who was promoting the United States TikTok ban, we'll call it, right, loosely.
Yeah. TikTok ban, sure.
The Supreme Court decision on Friday the 17th upheld the act that would ban TikTok without certain exceptions like divestiture, which we'll get into. So then the next day, Saturday the 18th, you tried to sign into TikTok and we're told what?
Yeah, I got this message that said, and I saw a million people posting this, so I'm sure that people who are listening who are on TikTok probably saw this. It was sort of bizarre to see, honestly, because it had a very particular touch to it. It said, sorry, TikTok isn't available right now. A law banning TikTok has been enacted in the U.S. Unfortunately, that means you can't use TikTok for now. We are fortunate that President Trump has indicated that he will work with us on a solution to reinstate TikTok once he takes office. Please stay tuned. And I thought it was weird because it kind of had a partisan bent to it, but also they said President Trump when he was not president at the moment.
Okay.
But then I woke up Sunday morning just to check again.
The 19th of January.
That's right. Mm-hmm. And it said, welcome back. Thanks for your patience and support. As a result of President Trump's efforts, TikTok is back in the U.S. ! You can continue to create, share, and discover all the things you love on TikTok. So it felt kind of, I don't know, it felt like very stuntish or something that it was out for a little bit. But I think it's very easy, and I've seen this a lot, to fall into conspiracy theory about it in part and be like, oh, this was just some sort of stunt to make President Trump look cool, like he brought TikTok back. But one thing people, I think, forget is that Trump initiated the TikTok ban, or at least was the first guy in power who was talking about it, I think in 2020, right?
Well, not only did he initiate it via executive order in August of 2020, but then he enacted, we could say, he brought the act that the Supreme Court upheld on Friday.
Right.
So this was all Trump's law. So you're right. It started in September 2020, and then in August 2020 was his executive order, and then September 2020 he brought this act under the. I had to go back and look. So under his authority as the executive branch, right, the president, under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act and the National Emergencies Act, to prohibit certain transactions by TikTok. Actually, it's ByteDance, right? If we want to get into the nuance, because ByteDance is the U.S. subsidiary and
of
company.
The Chinese company that owns TikTok.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. So the Secretary of Commerce published that list of prohibited transactions that affected TikTok in September 2020, and then that started all the litigation that culminated in the Supreme Court opinion on Friday.
So why, I mean, for people that are listening, I think there are many different questions that I have and that people that are listening might have. Is it sort of why ban TikTok? And there's the element of it that's we hear words like national security. But once it got to Congress, there was Josh Hawley, who's a pretty well-known, I guess, Republican and super conservative dude, very Trump-friendly guy.
He was a Trump supporter through the January 6th hearings.
Yeah, he was the guy that raised his fist at the January 6th thing, at the people who were storming the Capitol. But beyond all that, why are people saying ban TikTok?
Yeah, so the crux of the purpose of the act that was the subject of the court opinion, and then the court opinion reiterates it a lot. It says that because there is evidence that China is using TikTok in two ways that could potentially harm U.S. foreign security, that this is the reason why this ban should override any First Amendment protections that TikTok and its
What are
users
those two ways?
have. So the first way is that it's collecting, it says broad swath of personal information about Americans. I think there's 170, or at least there were 170 million American users of TikTok at the time of this opinion. So it's collecting a lot of personal data. So basically they're saying, hey, this foreign power who is adverse to us, and we're worried about our national security because we don't want them to have personal data on 170 million Americans. So that's reason one,
Okay.
which is interesting for a lot
Yes.
of reasons, because Americans and everyone else around the world put their personal data out
For everything.
in the world for a lot of different things.
To a million American companies, too.
Right. So
That's what you might be like, well, don't I give my eye movements and biometric data to like every single company I engage in an
lot.
app with, basically?
Yeah.
Facebook, Meta, Google, all of them are doing it.
Yep.
So it's like the national security angle feels very Cold War. And so it's like the Chinese have it.
right.
The communists have it.
Exactly.
Which makes sense. I mean,
Russia.
part of me is like, well, every other social media company that's owned by an American company is subjected to some government oversight, right? I mean,
More
they don't
now,
protect us from any of it,
Right,
but-
we've had a lot of those hearings. We've seen Mark Zuckerberg testify in front of Congress multiple times now because regulation has lagged so far behind tech.
yeah.
And of course it still is. And so the second reason that they
Yes.
said China should not have this information is because it's been demonstrated that China is using it to injure Americans in terms of the information that's being put in front of American users by TikTok's algorithm.
And I wonder what the evidence is for injury. Like how, like that sounds like it sounds like a very like legal kind of concept.
Yeah, so
What
the
constitutes
general opinion, the per curiam opinion, didn't go into it. There were two concurrences, and one of them was by Justice Sotomayor, and one of them was by Justice Gorsuch. And Justice Gorsuch went out of his way to say, I'm really glad that the opinion did not use any of the nationally sensitive security protected information that was put in front of the court to justify their opinion, because he thought that would set a dangerous precedent that apparently the court was provided certain
So they're
evidence
saying we know, but we're not going to tell you.
under seal for national security reasons that was not made part of the public docket, or
Yeah.
just usually you can sign on, see the pleadings, what evidence is given to the court, not this stuff. Whatever Gorsuch was saying, hey, I'm really glad our opinion didn't reference any of that, because that could set a dangerous precedent that future opinions could rely on information and data that wouldn't be available to people outside of those litigating a particular case.
So, I assume part of it is that there's the assumption that there's like election manipulation going on, misinformation, fake news, like that sort of stuff. All of me is kind of like, well, that exists on all the other networks. Like, what was funny about it is like, okay, if TikTok is canceled or banned, everyone just pops on over to Instagram or YouTube or these other places to basically watch the same stuff.
Right. And if again, we don't know, right, what, if any information may have swayed them that was provided to them that they don't mention here and say they didn't rely on. But you're right. And we've heard, what was it, in the election 4 years ago, about like how many bots were influencing elections and providing false information to people in certain information silos. So clearly we know that other foreign powers or just private parties manipulate information that's available on the internet.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
I don't think anybody, hopefully, believes that everything they read on the internet is true and well-intentioned.
I know, but it's like it's like its own world in some ways. But at the same
internet?
time, it does impact the real world. I mean, part of me is just thinking about like the image of Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos and these other tech dudes at the inauguration this morning, like kind of sucking up to Trump, and you're kind of like, there's an angle on it that's kind of that says that, well, doesn't it benefit Zuckerberg to ban TikTok, right? Because it's more traffic to his
sites? Maybe. It could also, if it sets a injurious precedent to other owners of large social media sites like Zuckerberg or other, we could call them like tech czars.
Yes.
Precedent, they have to be very careful about precedent that they support and don't support. And this opinion, TikTok v. Garland, goes into detailed First Amendment analysis. And even the justices who all end up signing on to the ultimate opinion disagree about what level of First Amendment scrutiny should be applied. That becomes very important if you're somebody like Zuckerberg, looking at, okay, well, what additional regulations could be coming down the pike, and how am I going to be able to oppose, or how would I be injured by them?
Yeah, it's weird. I feel like these First Amendment questions are, obviously not settled, but that, Mark Zuckerberg had a weird video a couple weeks ago where he sort of apologized for going overboard on censorship during the Biden administration. And if you remember, I don't know if you saw any of these like Facebook posts, or there was like content moderation that basically said there were warnings on certain videos and certain posts that said like this might be disinformation, and then they would like take down videos that were too much questioning of vaccines, too much questioning of the election, and like the big lie with the Trump stealing the election, or I guess Biden stealing the election, whatever. There was a lot of moderation from Facebook that was saying like, we're not going to let you see this stuff. And now Zuckerberg is reversing himself and saying, no, we want it to be totally free. We want everyone to say whatever they want. But it's not really true, because it feels like they have to moderate a little bit. They can get into legal trouble by allowing certain types of material to be posted on there, right? I'm thinking about like illegal material specifically.
Sure. Child pornography is a really clear example. If you're going to get into First Amendment speech debate about what kind of speech we have said can be regulated by its content.
Right.
Hate speech has been banned for a long, long time.
But how do you define hate speech? Is that something that the court argues over?
We have many court opinions defining hate speech. So there are examples, right? Or like speech that could pose a significant enough danger to those around you. So that classic example is you can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater.
Right.
Because you are posing a substantial risk to everybody around, that then everybody's going to freak out and run, and somebody could get trampled.
Interesting. I wonder if you said, like, if you put a Facebook post up that says there's a fire, in the mountains in Santa Monica, evacuate now.
Right.
When there wasn't.
And then somebody gets injured because of the evacuation, that speech would not be protected.
Wow.
Under long-standing precedent. So here, to get back to your point about Zuckerberg, those regulations that Facebook had when just not allowing certain content, those are not content neutral, right? I phrase it in the double negative because that's how the court looks at it.
Right.
Is the restriction content neutral, or is it based on the content of the speech? So if it's something about vaccines, that's not content neutral, right? It's content specific.
Right.
And so it's going to have to pass a higher level of scrutiny with the court, because we don't want, under our First Amendment, anybody, especially a government or a regulation or law, saying that certain speech on a particular topic of one persuasion is not allowed,
right,
but of the other is, because then the speech is obviously no longer free.
Right. It becomes hyper-partisan. But
so if Zuckerberg has engaged in that type of non-content neutral restrictions, which Facebook has, then, if there are challenges going forward, especially under this new opinion, then he may get struck down, or regulation of that type could get struck down.
So what do you think will happen with TikTok? I think a lot of people are wondering, because this doesn't seem like it's over. Part of it seems like the problem that the United States government was having with TikTok is that it's owned by or significantly influenced by the Chinese government. How does that change with Trump putting it back? Because it's so weird to see like Trump positioning himself and others positioning him as the like hero that brought back TikTok when he's the guy that suggested banning it in the first place.
Yep.
You're sort of like, well, what changed?
Not just suggested, but enacted the
Right.
law
Okay.
that banned it.
Actually did it.
He did.
Yeah.
He did. He and his cabinet did. And then throughout the course of the Biden administration in 2021 and 2022, there were negotiations because at that time the legislation challenging Trump's executive order was held in abeyance by the D.C. Circuit Court. So in the federal court system, the D.C. Circuit Court is below the United States Supreme Court.
Right.
And so the Circuit Court held it in abeyance because the government and TikTok's representatives, attorneys, were telling them, hey, let's see if we can work out a deal where the exemption in the act, which would allow TikTok to move forward if they divest Chinese ownership and interest in TikTok's U.S. operations. Let's see if we can work that out. So they tried and they couldn't. And so that's why then this went forward. But to get back to your question, kind of to me, it was like about when this also and why now.
Yeah, the timing is so weird.
So under the act, the app here, TikTok, right, the app that's affected by this law, had 270 days after the law's enactment to divest, basically come into compliance with the law. Otherwise, the suspension would happen 270 days after. And that 270-day mark was yesterday, January 19th, 2025.
Just happened to coincide with the day before the inauguration.
I don't know that.
That's so weird.
I don't know if that's coincidence or how that date of enactment was determined, because it would have fallen in the Biden administration, right?
Well, doesn't it make you think that it's part of a larger sort of question of like what social media is and its impact on young people, its impact on the direction of society, etc. These are questions that like we didn't really deal with when you and I were younger, before there was social media. It was this technology is so powerful that it feels like it does bring up really, really big questions, because I don't know, I think a lot of people looked at the TikTok ban and they were like, good. Nothing good comes from TikTok, right? Like it melted my kid's mind and it melted my grandpa's mind. There's sort of like, there's a thought that there is like a thought control element to it. And the reason I brought up Josh Hawley is because there were other Republicans, not just him, who were using like the protests happening around Palestine and Israel and saying like, TikTok is biased against Israel and you're seeing all this like pro-Palestinian content. And part of me was like, well, shouldn't you be allowed to see that stuff? It'd be weird to say that the state should intervene and say you're not allowed to see pro-Palestinian content, whatever you think of that.
Right.
Right?
Right. I think this is, and the answer to your question is an ideological one, but also a constitutional one. So if we are going to say we have the right to free speech, the right to free assembly, all of the rights actually enshrined in a Bill of Rights, then are we going to trust ourselves and our fellow citizens with that right? Or do we want the government coming in and saying, actually, you don't have the right to free speech, or access to free information or free press, because we're going to determine what is healthy or good for you.
Right.
I am of the ilk that says I do not want the government making that decision for me. I'll make my own decision, and
I think
if I'm
most
gonna
people feel that way.
If except those parents and grandchildren that you just mentioned that say that TikTok is rotting people's brains,
Well,
right?
yeah.
But if I want to stay indoors all day and do nothing but play video games, consume social media, and eat Twinkies, don't I
your
have the
problem.
right to do that as an American?
What about do heroin though?
No.
No.
Right?
Right.
Right? Because
the
we draw
government
certain
does
lines.
Intervene on dangerous stuff.
Yeah.
Right? Famously, the government made alcohol illegal in the 19 teens and 20s, and it didn't work. It created a whole criminal enterprise. It's a famous example, but it is ideological and philosophical. It's sort of like, okay, how much is the state going to protect us from ourselves and from others? Because there's sort of like, I don't know, the idea that young people are looking at videos that encourage them to kill themselves, right? And there's like an epidemic of young people doing this. You're sort of like, oh, should that be illegal?
Right.
And if so, who's regulating this? Like the government or the companies themselves? Because the companies seem like right now, Zuckerberg's attitude seems to be like, I want it as free as possible. Whereas a couple years ago, he was like, we need to deeply regulate this.
Yeah.
It's sort of interesting.
It's very interesting, especially because he has so much power and he's had so much power for so long.
Mm-hmm.
And there are other individuals that have held so much power, right? Like I said, TechStar earlier, right? So we could talk about Jeff Bezos in charge of Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly Zuckerberg in charge of what it's called Meta now, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube.
Yeah.
Right? It's now multiple things. So to me, it brings up, from a legal standpoint, questions of antitrust, which antitrust laws were formed after we saw about actually 100 years ago, you would know this, in U.S. history, too much power combining in the hands of too few. So that now we have these tech stars who are running these tech companies that have so many users. There's no competition. So that, as you're talking about what Zuckerberg is doing, you're essentially describing what sounds like a national policy on social media.
Right.
Because he has so much control. So from a legal standpoint, it brings up, okay, do we have too much power consolidated in the hands of too few? And especially now in terms of like regulation making, and if they all have close relationships with the incoming president, what effect is that going to have on our regulation and laws that we'll see now? And of course, we can now compare it to this law that was at issue in TikTok v. Garland, since that was originally a Trump law, which is fascinating.
It's scary because, I mean, so the Supreme Court essentially said that the national security element of this, like China having access to the biometric data, China having the ability to control minds with their algorithm, that's too dangerous. That's something that's absolutely so dangerous that it overcomes free speech protections. And yet Zuckerberg has that power. The others have, the American companies have that power. And that seems like a landscape that needs to be interrogated in the future.
So you can actually use here the framework that we have for First Amendment and other constitutional protections to articulate what you are in a legal framework. So when I said earlier, free speech is involved, but different justices disagree about what level of scrutiny should be put on this act. And that directly relates, like just to back up, right? If you have strict scrutiny is the highest amount of scrutiny that a court can put on a U.S. law. And if you have the level of strict scrutiny, then you've got to have an important government interest that is overriding our right to free speech. And that regulation's got to be narrowly tailored to the desired outcome so as to restrict as little speech as possible. Right? And so the opinion, I won't call it majority opinion because everyone agrees on the court. The per curiam opinion says that this is not strict scrutiny. Both of the concurring opinions say, we're not so sure. We do think that there are issues in play here with namely the First Amendment, that mean that this should be a strict scrutiny review. But we think it would pass. But the reason they're noting that is because, as I said earlier, the level of scrutiny that's put on a law like this matters for cases moving forward and regulations moving forward. And notably, this opinion actually disagreed with the court below it, the D.C. Circuit Court, because the D.C. Circuit Court said this is strict scrutiny, but it passes strict scrutiny because, as you said, the government's interest overrides the First Amendment interest that we have here.
So they're saying, and that's what is interesting to me is sort of like, why a TikTok ban? Why isn't there a more sort of specific targeting of particular biometric data collection or particular types of content? There's just no clear rule here.
Because then they would be getting into restricting the content of speech. Right? Whereas here, the per curiam opinion says this is a content neutral restriction. We are restricting collection of data for all 170 users in the same way, meaning we don't want it in the hands of the Chinese government. It can go ahead and continue operating if the Chinese government's interest and access to that information is divested. So there were two things there that I just said, right?
Yeah.
One is that it's content neutral and that it's not saying you can collect everything except like, like reading like eye data of those users, who are looking at it, because that could lead to, as we know from other things we've discussed in the last like few months even, that could lead to like government collection of neuro privacy data that's now protected in California and Colorado from technology is so advanced now that it can read often from certain biometrics what we're actually thinking. So it's like thought privacy can come into play.
Spooky.
That would be a regulation on the content of the speech.
Right.
That's being put out there by TikTok users. Here the court says, nope, it's not content specific, it's content neutral, because we're saying they can't have any of it. We don't want the Chinese government to have any of it.
But it only lasted for 12 hours.
Well, so interestingly, under the law, the president can grant a one-time 90-day extension to that 270-day waiting period between time of enactment and time of suspension.
So Trump put out a statement that's like, we're going to try to like buy it or half of it or try to work something out.
Right. So the act does give the president authority. It's actually, I'm surprised that the court didn't touch on this at all, because the act in my mind is very broadly written in terms of how much power it gives the president in this situation, which isn't any surprise, right? Because the president wrote the law.
Right.
And his people wrote the law.
Yeah, what did I see about that? The president, the president could declare that ByteDance has already complied with the law. This last option, according to Alan Rothenstein at lawfare.com, is the most likely, since all it requires is for ByteDance to persuade the president, not Congress or the Department of Justice, that it has performed a, quote, qualified divestiture. In other words, if ByteDance goes through the motions of reshuffling some details of its ownership stake in TikTok, the law permits Trump to say that all is well, TikTok is no longer Chinese, and the app can continue mainlining digital crack into Americans' brains.
Yes,
a little
that is true.
Editorializing there. But I mean, I think it's weird because I feel like people have mixed emotions about this. On the one hand, I think there is a lot of people who are sort of horrified by what social media, especially like TikTok, has done to people in terms of the power it has over attention, the power it has to spread misinformation or disinformation, that sort of thing. But on the other hand, I think Americans are very wary of and skeptical about the government stepping in and saying you can't have this anymore. When it comes to anything, I remember when they banned Four Loko? Remember Four Loko?
No.
It was like an energy drink
No.
that was like, I don't know if it was alcoholic. It might have been. It was messing people up. And the government banned it. And people were like
straight
whoa.
ethanol or what?
Yeah, I mean, Four Loko. What was Four Loko? Luckily, we have our laptops now. Four Loko is a premium malt beverage, a line of alcoholic beverages sold by Fusion Projects. It was discontinued at some point. The restrictions on sale. Yeah, the ban of caffeinated alcoholic drinks in the United States, right? So that goes back to sort of the government as a kind of caretaker. We banned cigarette smoking. I mean, I remember when I first moved to New York, people were really upset. The ban on cigarettes had just happened.
Yeah.
And they didn't ban cigarettes, but they banned smoking in
restaurants.
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember
people
first
mad
time
about
I
that,
went
right?
to New York, there was still smoking in restaurants.
Because they made a compelling case, I assume, that it hurt other people to smoke in a restaurant.
Yes.
They didn't really get a choice in the matter.
Yep. Yep. And so that overriding public interest in protecting the public health was enough to justify the restriction on what business owners would have argued in front of the court. It was their right to allow people to smoke or not smoke. Right. Or if it could be a challenge from a different perspective, if a particular restaurant patron wanted to challenge the law that restricted their right to smoke in the restaurant, then the court would be balancing those interests, an individual's right to smoke anywhere with the government's interest in protecting the others who don't want to inhale the smoke in a smaller enclosed space.
It did change things, though. People don't smoke as much at all anymore.
No.
Whenever I go to Las Vegas and I see like a guy with a cigarette in his hand, like inside, I'm like always like, wow, that's an odd sight. But when I was growing up, I saw people smoking everywhere.
Yeah. No, you're right. Now it's rarer. So that even just on our block here, a couple days ago, I noticed two women who looked like they were taking a work break on the balcony.
Yes.
And they were having a cigarette. And I looked to see, like, what kind is that, right? Is it like an e-cigarette? Is it a flavored
weed?
cigarette?
Yeah.
Is it weed? What is
Yeah.
it? It looked like an old school traditional cigarette.
Wow. See, it's like a blast from the past.
Yeah. Well, everything usually comes full circle and the pendulum will swing back and forth.
You think we'll have cigarettes back in restaurants and bars in our lifetime?
I don't know.
I would be surprised.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's weird because that's what I wonder about social media. Like, social media to me is a drug, functions like a drug. Everyone says that if you hook up people's brains to, a brain machine, whatever they call those. I'm not a scientist.
Mm-hmm.
And look at the way the brain behaves while they're scrolling through TikTok. It's like the same as like levels of like cocaine and alcohol in their system, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it is functioning as a drug.
But the difficulty is that speech, our First Amendment, one of our, most precious rights as Americans that we all love to,
Speech
say
is a drug.
makes us American. Speech, the right to free speech is implicated if you're going to restrict one's access to read whatever you want on your phone.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So, yeah. So the government has to show that it meets that overriding, narrowly tailored interest. Here in TikTok, national security. But you're describing one that pertains to public health, which may be coming next.
Yeah, I guess I'm just thinking of the different angles on it because, I mean, if you remember Josh Hawley, I don't know if you remember this moment, but Hawley did this grandstanding thing where he brought Zuckerberg to Congress. I think it was like 2 years ago. And he had all these parents in the audience in Congress, parents of like murdered and very badly hurt young women, basically.
Kids who were cyberbullied in many instances.
Sex trafficking.
And committed suicide.
Yeah,
and
all sorts of horrible stuff. And Holly was like, hey, Mark Zuckerberg, do you want to stand up and turn around and apologize to all these parents for the damage that your social media app has done to these parents and done to these kids? And Zuckerberg was all uncomfortable. We're so far from that moment now. Yeah. Like, in a lot of ways, like, Holly is now attacking the, like, national security element of it rather than the sex trafficking and cyberbullying element of it. But either way, there is like a push, it seems like, I don't know if it's on the right or the left or maybe both, to say like social media needs to be regulated in some way.
Right. Well, because at its core, you're talking about social media as a platform for promulgating speech.
Right.
And those typically have been off limits because if you look back like at the inception of our First Amendment jurisprudence, it's all about protecting the town square.
Right.
It was way back in the day, especially
the
back in England.
Town square. There was a real town square.
There was a town square with a box, and people would step up, where the term soapbox comes from. You take your soapbox, you flip it upside down, you stand in the middle of the town square, and you say whatever you want, no matter how crazy you are or how brilliant you are. And so the idea behind free speech protections is that we want to enshrine, the sanctity of the ability and the space to express our opinion. And so that today's town square and soapbox is Facebook, Meta, TikTok, YouTube, Google, Amazon, right? In terms of commerce.
And they're more powerful, right, than just like the guy on the soapbox in the town square. They seem like
they're amplified
because it's in your pocket. Anyone can look at it. It also like there's
170 million users.
Yeah.
On TikTok.
And there's something about, I know you're not an addict to this stuff, Danielle, but like there's something about video content itself that is extraordinarily addicting, obviously. I mean, there are so many people that I like the whole like book talk thing that's happening where people are trying to read more is in part a reaction to feeling like I don't know how to read anymore because I'm so addicted to like scrolling through videos.
Right. Did you notice yesterday? So we're also in NFL playoffs, of course, and we have our partner picks going.
Yes.
Did you notice in the first game yesterday, it was snowing, there's a player, I don't remember what team he's on. He's reading kind of like this self-improvement book.
Right.
And he reads it on the sidelines, and he's highlighted certain passages.
Wow.
And the commentators were talking about how now this book has jumped to Amazon's #1 bestseller recently because he's given it, the platform, of course, has given it that many more customers. But that's a positive example of what you're talking about, right?
Yeah,
It's
I
like
mean,
here you have this huge, like model of physical strength in this NFL player on the sideline reading a book that he's highlighted, and he said he does it because he has mastered his physical game. He's now trying to master his mental game.
Right.
And his mental
Build
toughness.
the brain.
But back to this notion that social media platforms are now our town square. As I was saying, you don't usually regulate the platform, the town square.
Mm-hmm.
There are obvious examples. If a government is the town square, like a school, where you can't allow certain groups to come and assemble on a government piece of property, like a school, unless you're going to be content neutral.
Right.
So in other words, like you can't allow a Jewish church to come and put on a presentation or meet and assemble on a public school grounds if you're not going to allow all other religions to do that. It's got to be content
Equal
neutral.
time. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There are so many ironies to all of that, because I was just reading this book called The Bookshop that's about like the history of bookstores. And Benjamin Franklin was like an early bookstore owner, and he was involved with print culture and as a printmaker and all that stuff. And it was tied to the revolution, was the idea that we all have access to information. I mean, printmaking was like a new technology at that moment. And when the British government is saying there's going to be regulations on this stuff, it's part of the whole spirit of American Revolution. So it feels like a very inborn American thing to be like, I have the right to consume anything. But at the same time, what you're saying is there's always been some restrictions on speech.
In America or before?
In America.
Yeah, I think I'd have to
There are
look back and see
constitutional questions.
what was the first case that litigated the First Amendment right to free speech. I don't know that off the top of my head.
I don't know that whole history either, but I know that it's an open question. It's not just like, I think people say, well, you get to say whatever you want. I think, in my American government textbooks, I teach an American government class every now and then, they have examples like, well, can you really say whatever you want? Like, is it free speech to share national secrets publicly, if you work for the government and
right.
Is it free speech to take a bottle of water and put a label on it that says this cures cancer and then go sell it? Is
right.
that free speech? And there are like all sorts of examples like that where you're like, okay, they're saying if there's a danger or if there's like some sort of compelling reason why that speech shouldn't be legal, we'll actually restrict it.
Yeah, and I think it relates to another issue we have had with China, right, is not observing patents
right.
and copyright and trademark, the intellectual property that we've decided that our laws can protect because it was the work of whoever came up with that idea that's then being protected by the law. You can't stand behind a First Amendment right and say, well, no, I get to, use this clip from this movie.
Right.
And without giving, due rights or being paid for it.
My videos get taken down all the time for having like a bit of a song in it or a clip from a movie. Like they don't allow that at all. And they have algorithms to stop that. So
yeah,
I'm like, is that a free speech issue for me? Like, well, no, because someone else owns that.
And they can get sued.
Right.
They can get sued. So that's an example of restrictions on this, the platform that we're talking about here. But China hasn't adhered to a lot of those. And it's another issue we've had with them getting back to. We don't know what information was put in front of the court in terms of what China's doing with the information that poses a threat to national security. It's very vague, in the opinion.
AOC on a TikTok, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Democratic Congresswoman, she was saying that she was part of the Foreign Affairs Committee that watched the presentation for this law about TikTok, and she was like, we were all sitting there waiting for some more specific information as to why this was a national security threat, and we didn't get it. She actually voted against the ban, which I thought was interesting. I think a lot of Democrats did vote for it. This was kind of a bipartisan thing.
Well, all of the justices agreed with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, which to me is surprising in light of the information that's shared in the opinion, because so what they said is that data collection and analysis is a common practice in this digital age, right? Nobody can dispute that. But TikTok's scale and susceptibility to foreign adversary control together with the vast swaths of sensitive data the platform collects, justify differential treatment to address the government's national security concerns.
Does that convince you? Like, just from a legal standpoint?
No, because the first idea that came to me and that keeps coming back to me is that because we put our information out there all the time in so many different ways, why is it just this platform and China's access to that information that is problematic?
Yeah.
Why not? We could probably do a little bit of research and come up with a lot of other examples that would meet this same definition.
I agree. It's just like, it just seems like the foreign ownership angle is what they came up with to limit TikTok. And they had all these other sort of reasons that they were attaching to it. But it seems like we need and I wouldn't want like a blanket policy, but it feels like we're still in a new frontier in terms of thinking of how we balance the legal elements of this with the impact that social media has on our world. And getting back to the book thing, I don't want to say that automatically books are better and that, like, reading books are better, but I feel like it kind of is, and people feel that way. That football example is kind of funny to me because that Barnes & Noble right now, part of the reason Barnes & Noble is turning around and surviving, they've been like Barnes & Noble has been threatened for a long time, but I was just reading that Barnes & Noble is doing really well all of a sudden. And one of the reasons it's doing well is because of TikTok. Like, book talk is huge, and it popularizes all these books. And if you go to Barnes & Noble now, there's like a whole section of like book talk books. And so it's like there's irony upon irony in terms of how information travels and what people will prefer.
Yeah. Well, and that's why I ultimately think what Sotomayor said very briefly, just 2 paragraphs, she simply said that First Amendment scrutiny should be applied to this act just by virtue of the platform that we're talking about. Right. It's clearly implicating so many different speech rights. And Gorsuch said the same thing, but he listed more reasons that he wanted to note, including that the court only had 2 weeks to consider the briefing and issue this opinion. When this is a hugely important First Amendment free speech opinion, and Gorsuch said we only have 2 weeks to do this because the deadline to cut off under the 270
the timing
days
is so strange.
Was January 19th.
But
he also said he had, quote, serious reservations about whether the law before us is content neutral. Also saying strict scrutiny should apply. And yeah, it is important just for decisions going forward. But ultimately, the per curiam opinion that everybody signed said that a law targeting any other speaker, meaning not TikTok, would by necessity entail a distinct inquiry and separate considerations. So they're saying, hey, this only applies to this act, but really also only to TikTok, which is not how court opinions work, right? We apply them to other situations all the time.
Picked on.
And then it went on to say, on this understanding, we cannot accept petitioner's call for strict scrutiny. No more than immediate scrutiny is in order. Quote, important government interests related to suppression of free expression and does not, I think that's probably my typo, and does not burden substantially more speech than necessary to further that interest, as compared to like the narrowly tailored standard that strict scrutiny gives us.
Right.
This is a little broader. It's easier to meet, which usually indicates that the court doesn't think that the law would pass strict scrutiny. So
this makes me wonder how unique social media apps are as platforms for disseminating information. So, and I mean that in like even from just a legal standpoint, because it's like, are you saying that some speech would be okay if it were in a book or magazine, but would not be okay if it were appearing on a social media platform?
You couldn't do that. Not under existing First Amendment jurisprudence. There was a famous case in the 70s against the guy who owned the Hustler magazine.
Larry Flint.
Right?
Yep.
People versus Larry Flint.
It was
I think
a movie.
That's a movie.
Yeah.
But it was, the government saying that, hey, we should be able to regulate pornography. He sued. There's famous Supreme Court opinion that says, like, how do I know what pornography is? I know it when I see it.
Right.
So constitutional law opinions often go like this. They're very broad. They're often general. And then what I thought going through law school and reading all these opinions is that it's usually the ends justify the means. So whatever the majority of the court wants to do, they will find a way to justify it under intermediate scrutiny, strict scrutiny, or just the lowest level, which is just the rational basis test.
Interesting.
It was really disheartening for me as a law student. Like, there was zero consistency.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was all about what is the popular way to go on this decision.
Well, I mean, we're supposed to be I don't think we are in a moment with a conservative Supreme Court. And so part of me is like, well, wouldn't a conservative Supreme Court err on the side of the rights of people, free speech, things like that? But in this case, they're saying, no, there is a right for the government to restrict TikTok's ability to reach the American people.
You said, wouldn't a conservative court err on the side of enforcing people's rights generally?
Yeah. I mean, that's the libertarian view of conservatism, at least.
Sure, but the jurisprudence shows that it's dependent on what right we're talking about over time, right? Mm-hmm. Is it a privacy right that implicates a woman's right to choose and control her body through a reproductive process? Is it a baker's decision to not sell a wedding cake to a gay couple? Is it a black person's right to sit at a soda counter in a restaurant that only wants to serve white people? Mm-hmm. It has just depended over time.
Like what you consider rights. Mm-hmm. The Larry Flint thing, I remember, was a public figure. Like, wasn't it something like that public figures can be subjected to satire? And if it's like satire, but you're like, well, what is satire? Because some speech can be really, inflammatory and ugly, libelous.
Yep, or defamatory.
Right. Yep. But if you just say, well, it's satire.
If you're a public figure.
It's a joke, folks.
Yeah, if you're a public figure, then the scale shifts because you're putting yourself out there in the public sphere. And so, yes, then the public has a greater right to comment and then ultimately may not be as liable or liable at all for something that could be potentially libelous or defamatory. Whereas if you're not a public figure, then that scale shifts and the speech goes under a heightened scrutiny because we don't have that more compelling government interest in allowing speech of a non-public figure. It's basically like, who cares?
Right. Mm-hmm. There's lots more that'll happen, I'm sure, with TikTok and social media over just the course of the next year, I would say. And we got 90 days.
90 days, if they're going to follow the law.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Thank you, Danielle.
Thanks, David.